breaking, a line has been crossed. For the first time in modern history, King Charles has publicly confronted his own Prime Minister and the nation is trembling. Within hours of a leaked government memo showing Keir Starmer's plan to limit the monarchy's constitutional influence, Buckingham Palace responded not through aides or whispers, but through the King himself. His voice, calm yet cold, carried a message that ripped through Westminster like thunder. The Crown will not be silenced. Across Britain, the reaction was immediate. News channels interrupted broadcasts. The BBC called it a royal earthquake. Downing Street went dark. Press officers vanished from briefings. Within minutes, social media erupted with one word: rebellion. Because what began as a quiet policy dispute had turned into something far deeper. A clash of legitimacy, of history, of identity. The King had drawn a line in the sand and Starmer had stepped over it. Inside Parliament, panic spread like wildfire. Ministers whispered of a constitutional crisis. Some claimed Starmer's Modern Britain Bill was designed to remove the last ceremonial powers of the Crown, to make the monarchy a figurehead in name only. But others saw something darker, an attempt to reshape the British state entirely, replacing centuries of balance with raw political control, and that, to the King, was an attack on the soul of the nation. As the statement went public, the palace courtyard filled with reporters. They expected silence. Instead, they got fury. The King's tone was measured, but his message was unmistakable. When the government forgets its duty to serve rather than rule, he said, the people lose more than their freedoms. They lose their faith. Those words echoed across every living room in Britain. For some, it was a declaration of moral courage. For others, it was the beginning of open war between the Crown and the elected government. Within hours, Starmer's aides were in damage control. Leaked texts from his inner circle spoke of containment, narrative management, and preparing for constitutional backlash. Yet no amount of spin could disguise the truth. The King had done the unthinkable. He had intervened. Not as a monarch above politics, but as a guardian of principle. It was a move that divided the nation, but electrified it too. In pubs across Manchester and cafes in London, people debated not policy, but loyalty. Who speaks for Britain, the King who represents its soul, or the Prime Minister who governs its body? A poll taken within hours showed a seismic shift. Trust in the government dropped by 21%. Meanwhile, support for the monarchy surged to levels unseen since Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee. Something deep had awakened, a quiet defiance in the public mood, a belief that perhaps traditions still mattered more than slogans. The King's allies who served inside the establishment were retired generals, former civil servants, even bishops began to voice support. Lord Westfield, once a Starmer advisor, called the government's actions reckless constitutional vandalism. Yet in Downing Street, Starmer's reaction was the opposite. Those close to him say he was livid and pacing the floor, shouting about medieval interference. Sources inside Number 10 described the atmosphere as combustible. Some ministers wanted to retaliate publicly to remind the monarchy of its ceremonial place. But others warned, you don't win by attacking the King, you fall by it. By nightfall, the situation escalated further. Thousands gathered outside Buckingham Palace, holding candles, waving flags, chanting, God save the King. It wasn't royalist nostalgia, but it was rebellion against what many saw as government arrogance. The scene felt almost cinematic. Police sirens, camera flashes, chants echoing into the foggy London night. Across the river, the lights of Parliament burned late. Inside, Starmer's team met in secret, trying to decide whether to defuse the crisis or escalate it. Then came the whisper that changed everything. Reports that Starmer was considering invoking an emergency parliamentary vote to redefine the limits of royal influence. The news leaked before dawn. It was the final spark. The King's supporters, inside and outside the establishment, began to rally. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson tweeted a single phrase, never interfere with the Crown. Nigel Farage called it the day Britain remembered who it was. Even Prince William, usually silent, was said to be deeply disturbed by Starmer's plan. Britain was divided into two camps. Those who believed in the government's authority and those who stood behind the King. The air was thick with tension, as if history itself were being rewritten in real time. And through it all, one truth echoed louder than ever. The monarchy had found its voice again, and it wasn't going back to silence. But what came next would push Britain to the edge of constitutional collapse. Because as Starmer prepared his next move, whispers from inside the palace hinted at something unprecedented, a royal countermeasure not seen in over a century. A direct challenge to the Prime Minister himself. Westminster was no longer a seat of government. It was a fortress under siege. The streets outside Downing Street were lined with barricades, journalists and protesters holding signs that read, "Protect the Crown and down with Starmer." The government's communications team had gone silent, their usual calm replaced with fear. Inside, Starmer faced his cabinet with a trembling jaw and eyes full of fury. Reports say he slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "No monarch will dictate my government's future!" But across the city, another plan was already unfolding, one crafted quietly inside Buckingham Palace overnight. The king's advisors had gathered in the old library, surrounded by the portraits of his ancestors who had ruled through wars, revolutions and betrayals. Charles sat at the head of the table, his tone steady, but his resolve unshakable. He had made a decision, not to retreat, but to act. A draft letter was prepared, addressed to the Speaker of the House of Commons. It wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't polite. It was a constitutional warning. In it, the King accused the Prime Minister of violating the spirit of the Crown's neutrality and endangering the unity of the realm. One senior palace source said it read like a declaration of moral war. He would not call for resignation outright. But the message was clear. Starmer had crossed into forbidden territory. When the letter was leaked to the press at 9 a.m, Britain froze. Headlines screamed, "King defies PM, first royal rebuke in a century." Crowds outside Buckingham Palace erupted in cheers. At Parliament, MPs poured into corridors whispering about a royal coup. And yet the truth was more complex. Charles wasn't seizing power. He was demanding accountability. For years, he had stayed silent, signing every law placed before him. But this time, something inside him had snapped. The government's plan to strip the monarchy's last symbolic duties wasn't reform. It was erasure. Starmer's aides urged calm, but the Prime Minister chose confrontation. At noon, he appeared before reporters, face tight with anger. "No one, not even the King, stands above democracy," he declared. The words were meant to sound strong, but they only deepened the rift. Within minutes, social media exploded with fury. Hashtags like hashtag stand with the King and hashtag Starmer out trended nationwide. Even traditional Labour voters began to question whether the government had gone too far. And then the unthinkable. Senior members of Starmer's own cabinet began to resign. Rachel Reeves was first, saying she could not in good conscience support actions that undermine Britain's constitutional heritage. 2 more ministers followed within the hour. The Prime Minister's majority was crumbling. Journalists outside Parliament could hardly believe what they were witnessing. One BBC correspondent whispered, "This isn't politics anymore, it's history unfolding." Meanwhile, in Buckingham Palace, the mood was grim, yet resolute. Advisors warned the King that he was risking everything. His reputation, the monarchy's neutrality, even the stability of the nation. But Charles replied quietly, "If the Crown stands for nothing, then Britain stands for nothing." Those words would later be repeated on every front page in the country. It was no longer just a political conflict. It had become a moral one. Behind closed doors, secret talks began between senior military officials and palace representatives. The generals insisted they would remain neutral, but sources later revealed growing unease among them. They feared civil unrest. The army had not been placed on alert, but regional commanders were told to monitor developments closely. The last time such language appeared in official notes was during the miners' strike of the 1980s. That alone showed how serious the crisis had become. Then came the broadcast that shook Britain to its core. At 6 p.m, the King addressed the nation directly from Windsor Castle. A rare move without government approval. His tone was calm, deliberate, yet heavy with warning. "There are moments," he said, "when silence becomes surrender. My duty is not to rule, but to remind those who do of the weight of their oaths." No leader may place ambition above country. His eyes lingered on the camera, steady and solemn. For millions watching at home, it felt less like a speech and more like a reckoning. Within minutes, the nation was split in two. Crowds of royal supporters flooded Trafalgar Square, waving Union Jacks, singing the national anthem. But in cities like Liverpool and Glasgow, counter-protests erupted. Banners reading "Power to the People" and "End the Crown." Police clashed with protesters as chaos spread. The government's press office released a statement calling the King's address inappropriate and inflammatory. Yet even critics admitted privately that his words carried moral weight. In the shadows, new alliances began to form. Nigel Farage called for a unity government under the Crown. Former Prime Minister Theresa May publicly urged Starmer to step back from the brink. And in one of the most dramatic turns, Prince William met with senior military officials at Sandhurst. A symbolic gesture that sent shockwaves through Whitehall. The heir to the throne was quietly making his position known. Britain was at breaking point. Civil servants whispered about resignation. Secret memos described fears of constitutional paralysis. Yet amid the uncertainty, one thing became clear. The old balance between Crown and Parliament had been shattered. The next move, many feared, would decide not just the future of a government, but the fate of the British state itself. And as the clock struck one, a secret meeting was convened inside Buckingham Palace, attended by the King, Prince William, and several key allies from the military and judiciary. What they discussed that night would remain hidden from the public, but within 48 hours it would ignite the greatest political firestorm Britain had seen since the abdication crisis. The meeting inside Buckingham Palace began in complete silence. The sound of rain against the old windows was the only noise in the room. Around the long oak table sat a handful of men and women, military officers, senior judges, and one visibly shaken archbishop. At the head of the table sat King Charles, his hands clasped tightly. His expression calm but unreadable. He looked older, sterner, as though the weight of centuries pressed against his shoulders. Everyone knew why they were there. The government had defied the Crown, and Britain stood on the brink of collapse. It was Prince William who spoke first. His voice was steady but heavy. "Father, if you act now, they'll call it interference. But if you do nothing, they'll erase everything this family stands for." The King nodded slowly. He had spent decades watching the monarchy evolve. Bending, yielding, accommodating. But now the question was survival itself. For the first time since the 1930s, the monarchy was preparing to push back. Documents were laid on the table and a constitutional motion drafted in secret by senior lawyers. It was called the Royal Safeguard Directive. It invoked an ancient clause from the Bill of Rights, one rarely mentioned in modern times, giving the monarch the authority to withhold assent on legislation that endangered the state's continuity. If enacted, it would effectively block Starmer's Modern Britain Bill from becoming law. It was a move unseen in modern democracy, legal but politically explosive. At dawn, the King signed it. His signature was swift, deliberate, final. Within hours, the document was hand-delivered to Parliament by royal messenger. It landed on the Speaker's desk just before the morning session. When the news broke, the Commons fell into chaos. MPs screamed. Some applauded, others walked out in protest. Reporters described the moment as the day Britain stopped breathing. Starmer, pale and furious, declared it an act of constitutional defiance and called an emergency session. Outside, the streets erupted again. Crowds of royalists poured toward Buckingham Palace in support, chanting, "Long live the King!" But in cities across Scotland and northern England, anti-monarchy protests turned violent. Police vans were overturned. Smoke filled the air. Britain was tearing itself apart in real time. The once unshakable calm of the United Kingdom had fractured into two nations, one loyal to the King and one to the government. By noon, the Prime Minister attempted his counterattack. He summoned Parliament and proposed an emergency vote to suspend royal assent, entirely, effectively stripping the monarchy of any constitutional power. It was political warfare, live on air. But what he didn't expect was the rebellion from within his own ranks. Over 40 Labour MPs crossed the aisle. They stood and declared that they could no longer serve a leader who disrespects the Crown and divides the country. A gasps echoed through the chamber. The vote collapsed before it began. Starmer's authority shattered in an instant. At that same hour, the king appeared again, but not through a speech, but through a royal proclamation broadcast live from Windsor. The words were calm, timeless, and devastating. This crown belongs not to the powerful, but to the people it serves. I act today not for privilege, but for protection, that Britain may never be ruled by fear or arrogance. He paused, looking directly into the camera. A leader who divides his nation is no leader at all. The impact was immediate. The markets froze. The pound dipped. Foreign media declared a British constitutional implosion. Donald Trump commented from Washington, calling the king a man of courage. Nigel Farage went live within minutes, proclaiming, "The Crown has done what Parliament wouldn't. It stood up for the people." Even the Archbishop of Canterbury released a statement urging peace, calling this a moment of moral clarity, not political chaos. And yet the chaos only deepened. Starmer's cabinet disintegrated overnight. Angela Rayner resigned, saying the government had lost its soul. The military publicly affirmed its loyalty to the Crown, promising to uphold stability and protect the public. By the following morning, Starmer stood alone, his eyes hollow, his tone bitter. He announced from Number 10 that he would temporarily step aside for the sake of national unity. The man who once promised a new era of government transparency had fallen, undone not by scandal or election, but by the will of a king. Across Britain, a strange calm settled. The protests faded. The headlines turned from anger to awe. It was as if the nation had witnessed something mythic, a clash between two powers that defined its very soul. The Crown had reawakened, not as a symbol, but as a force of conscience. For the first time in generations, Britain remembered that its history was not written by politicians alone. In the days that followed, a caretaker government was formed. Prince William stepped forward, quietly taking on more public duties as the king retreated into silence. There were no celebrations, no triumphal speeches, only reflection and the uneasy awareness that Britain had stood at the edge of its own undoing and stepped back. The monarchy had survived, but at a cost. The illusion of harmony was gone forever. Historians would later call it the royal intervention. A moment when silence ended and the throne spoke once more. And as the cameras faded and the country tried to breathe again, one phrase echoed across the island. The king saved Britain, but Britain will never be the same again.